The orchard was burning when Captain Marcus Ellery cut through the soldier's leg. The night was soaked in firelight and morphine, the air thick with mud and diesel, and every breath carried the metallic taste of shrapnel. He worked by the stuttering light of a flashlight wedged between his teeth, its beam trembling each time an artillery round shook the earth. The man beneath his hands thrashed weakly, half-conscious, uniform black with blood and soil. Ellery's scalpel was dull. He had honed it on the edge of a Jeep bumper hours ago. His gloves were torn. He no longer felt his own fingers. Each movement was methodical, automatic, a rhythm beaten into his muscles by too many nights like this, yet this night felt different. Too loud, too close, too final. He could hear the German 88's shifting position beyond the tree line, the deep-throated echo rolling closer with each impact. Somewhere behind him, a nurse screamed for more bandages, but there were none left. The supply truck had taken a direct hit 30 minutes ago. Ellery didn't look up. He couldn't afford the distraction. "Hold him steady," he muttered around the flashlight. The sergeant obeyed, pressing down on the soldier's chest as Ellery made the final cut. The limb came away in his hands, still twitching, and he felt the hot arterial spray coat his sleeve before he clamped it off with forceps that had already been sterilized twice over an open flame. Smoke blew in through the tent flap, bringing with it the smell of burning flesh. Someone yelled outside that the roof was catching. He didn't pause. "Next," he said hoarsely, though his throat was cracked from hours of shouting. He could feel the structure groaning overhead, the tarps, the canvas, the timber poles flexing under the heat. The wounded lay in rows around him, moaning, coughing, calling for their mothers, their wives, their gods. Ellery's mind shut out everything but the next pulse, the next breath, the next task that kept a man alive for one more minute. He wrapped the stump, tightened the tourniquet, felt his heartbeat match the hammering artillery. A young private burst in through the flap, eyes wide. "Sir, orders from command. They're pulling us back to the ridge. We can't hold this position." Ellery looked up for the first time in an hour. Through the rising smoke he could see the orchard's edge, the silhouettes of apple trees lit like torches. "Tell command I'm busy," he said flatly, reaching for another morphine ampoule. "Sir, the whole unit's moving. They'll cut off comms." "Then move faster," he snapped, breaking the glass neck of the ampoule. The private hesitated, then ran. Ellery injected the morphine into a corporal whose leg was half gone. The man's breathing steadied, his eyes fluttering beneath the glare. "You'll be fine," Ellery lied. He turned to his nurse, Lieutenant Havers, her face streaked with soot. "We're not leaving," he said quietly. She nodded without argument, as if the decision had already been made long before he said it. Outside, a shell landed so close the ground buckled. The tent shuddered, medical trays crashed, and the light flickered out. Darkness swallowed them. Someone screamed that the fuel drum was hit. Ellery grabbed his lighter and struck a flame. It barely held, but it was enough to see the men's faces, pale and glistening in the gloom. He remembered his brother for a moment. Jack, the paratrooper who'd jumped over St. Miraglise and never come back, and forced the thought away. He couldn't afford ghosts right now. He crawled toward the rear, where the tent wall was glowing red from heat. The orchard trees were snapping, branches collapsing under fire. He slashed a hole in the canvas with his scalpel, and dragged 2 wounded men through it into the open air. The night was chaos. Trucks burned along the hedgerow, their fuel tanks roaring like furnaces. The field was cratered, and the smell of apples mixed with cordite and flesh. A downed medic jeep lay twisted on its side, its supplies spilling into the mud. He saw opportunity in the wreckage. "Havers," he called, voice raw. "Get me those crates." She ran, ducking low as another shell screamed overhead. He hauled the men toward the ditch, using his own jacket as a pillow beneath one's head. The rain began to fall, thin, ash-laced, but enough to cool the air. He knew they had minutes before the next barrage. He shouted for volunteers, and those still able to stand staggered toward him, bandaged and half-conscious, dragging others by the shoulders. He barked orders, not caring about rank now. Set up tarps between the trucks. Use rifle poles for braces. We're not moving these men another inch. They worked like automatons, driven by something beyond reason. The orchard became a shadowed hive of movement. Men tying ropes, lighting lanterns, pulling stretchers out of the mud. The makeshift operating tent was born out of defiance, a skeletal thing of torn canvas, tree limbs, and raw courage. Ellery crawled inside and tore open a morphine crate with his scalpel, his breath steaming in the cold rain. For a moment, he looked up and saw the horizon flicker with distant muzzle flashes, each one a reminder that the front was still alive, that life itself was still stubbornly clinging on. He wiped his hands on a bloodied towel and began again. "Scalpel," he said, though no one was beside him. His voice trembled only once when a shell burst so near that the ground heaved, throwing him against the table. He steadied himself, gritted his teeth, and whispered through the noise, "You're not dying here, soldier." Around him, the rain hissed on hot metal, the orchard burned in patches, and the world narrowed to the circle of light from a single lantern. Somewhere above the din, the radio crackled with a voice demanding evacuation, but Ellery didn't answer. He pressed his hand against a chest wound, felt the faint flutter of a heartbeat returning, and exhaled as if life itself had answered him back. When dawn finally came, gray and trembling, the orchard was littered with smoke and silence, but under that torn canvas lay 14 men who still breathed. Ellery sat back, blood drying on his sleeves, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, and for a fleeting second he thought he could smell the apples again beneath the smoke, a reminder of something good, something living. He looked at the horizon where the next battle was already waiting and muttered to no one, "As long as one man's still breathing, we stay." Then he reached for the next wounded soldier, steady hands defying the world that told him to stop. The smoke from the orchard had barely thinned when the message from command came again, a clipped voice over the static ordering all medical units to fall back to the secondary line before the Germans pushed through the gap. Captain Ellery sat on a half-burned crate outside the torn canvas of his makeshift tent, his hands shaking from fatigue as he scrubbed the grime from his palms with a strip of gauze that had long since turned brown. Around him the wounded were scattered across the wet earth, the air thick with the low groans of men hovering between pain and sleep. A single lantern swung from a branch above, its flame guttering in the wind that carried the distant thump of artillery. He stared at the field map pinned to the inside of his mind more than the one on the ground. He knew the terrain by now, the ridge, the orchard, the shallow stream behind them. Falling back meant abandoning everyone who couldn't walk. He heard Havers approaching through the mud, her boots sinking with each step, her face hollow under the film of ash. "They say the trucks are leaving in an hour," she said quietly, holding out a tin mug of black coffee that smelled faintly of smoke and antiseptic. He took it, felt the warmth against his raw fingers, and said nothing for a long time. The sky above was low and gray, rain mixing with drifting ash that settled on their clothes like snow. "How many still need surgery?" he finally asked. 12, she said. 2 are critical. The others might hold if we move them slow." He nodded, though the motion felt mechanical, like a man agreeing with something he had already decided against. A medic from another unit stumbled into view, his helmet askew, radio strapped to his chest. "Orders are clear, sir," he said between breaths. "They're pulling the line to the ridge. Engineers are rigging the orchard road with charges. You've got to clear out before dusk." Ellery's eyes lifted toward the line of trees, their branches stripped bare by shrapnel. The thought of retreating through them, leaving behind the tent where 14 lives had been dragged back from death, felt like betrayal. "We can't move these men," he said. "We'll slow the column." "You'll die here," the medic replied. "So will they," Ellery said softly, finishing his coffee and standing. The medic hesitated, glanced toward the wounded, then ran off to deliver the same message somewhere else. Havers met Ellery's eyes. "You know what this means." He nodded again, slower this time, feeling the weight of command settle on him like the damp air. "Start with the ones who can move," he said. "Get them to the trucks. The rest stay here with me." She didn't argue, just pressed her lips together and turned toward the tent. The hours that followed were a slow unraveling of will. The sound of departing engines came and went, mingling with the distant hammer of guns, until the orchard felt deserted except for the wounded and the few who refused to leave. Ellery moved from stretcher to stretcher, checking pulses, tightening dressings, whispering short instructions that even he barely heard. One soldier clutched his sleeve as he passed. "They said we're leaving, sir," the man murmured, voice thin as paper. "You are," Ellery replied. "Soon." The lie came easily now, not out of deceit but necessity. The truth would kill morale faster than blood loss. By mid-afternoon the rain returned in earnest, drumming on the canvas roof, leaking through the seams. He sat beside a corporal whose lungs were filling with fluid, listening to each ragged breath. The corporal's eyes darted toward the open flap where the orchard smoldered. "You ever been home, sir?" he asked weakly. "Not lately," Ellery answered. "My wife grows roses. I can't keep them alive." The man smiled faintly, then turned his head and coughed until blood streaked his lips. When the sound faded, Ellery closed the corporal's eyes with 2 fingers and stood, his face empty of expression. Outside, he found Havers repacking what little remained of their supplies. "We'll need more light before nightfall," he said. "The oil's low," she answered. "Use the morphine lamps." She looked at him sharply. "Those are for anesthesia." "Not anymore," he said. The decision was final, and she didn't argue. They strung the morphine lamps along the canvas ceiling, the pale flame casting ghostly patterns on the walls. The orchard looked otherworldly now, a field of shadows and smoke, the kind of place history would forget because it was too ugly to remember. Ellery took stock of the men left. 6 stretcher cases, 2 barely conscious, and a handful of others who refused to leave without their brothers. He admired them for that, though it also condemned them. As darkness crept over the field, the sound of tanks reached them, distant but distinct, a rolling growl across wet earth. Havers froze, eyes meeting his. "They're closer than command thinks," she whispered. He nodded, calculating distances in his head, weighing the risk. "If they break through, we'll move the wounded to the streambed," he said. "Low ground, less visible." "And if they find us?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his scalpel, still crusted with dried blood, and cleaned it with a torn sleeve soaked in alcohol. The blade caught the lamplight, gleaming for a heartbeat like something sacred. He heard the wind shift, carrying the distant rumble of engines and shouted orders in German. The war was moving toward them again, a tide that never receded for long. He looked around the tent, his tent, improvised from scraps and defiance, and felt a strange calm settle over him. There was no glory here, no audience, just duty stripped to its core. A shadow passed the flap. One of his remaining orderlies, a kid barely out of training, came in with a field radio wrapped in cloth. "It still works," the boy said. "We could call for an airlift." Ellery shook his head. No time. And no pilot would land in this mess. He took the radio anyway, turned the dial until the static filled the tent like rain, then shut it off. "If we go silent, maybe they'll think we're already gone." The boy nodded uncertainly. Outside, another explosion rippled through the distance, closer this time. The ground trembled under their boots. Ellery walked out into the orchard, letting the drizzle hit his face, and watched the horizon flicker with fire. The apples that still clung to the trees were blackened husks now, swaying like pendulums in the wind. He thought of his brother again, wondering if this was the same kind of sky he had seen before dying. He wondered if Jack had been afraid. The thought made him tighten his jaw. Behind him, Havers called out that 2 more men had regained consciousness. He turned, nodded, and went back inside. The night grew heavy, the air so dense with smoke it felt like breathing through cloth. He moved from one patient to another, stitching, wrapping, whispering half-remembered prayers. At one point he caught his reflection in the mirror of a shattered instrument tray. Eyes sunken, face gray with fatigue, barely recognizable. The lanterns flickered as the wind howled through the orchard gaps. The sound of distant tank treads mingled with the steady drip of rain through the tent roof. He knew the ridge might already be lost, that reinforcements would not return before dawn, and yet he felt no panic. Only an odd clarity remained, a stillness beneath the chaos. When the wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of sea salt from the coast, he realized how near they still were to the invasion's beginning. All that sacrifice, all that blood, and still the line was uncertain. He stepped outside once more before dawn, the world dim and gray, the orchard now only a silhouette of broken trees. The horizon glowed faintly from fires miles away, and in that glow he could just make out the shape of the ridge they were ordered to reach. It looked impossibly far. He stood there until the cold began to bite through his coat, then whispered to himself, not as a soldier but as a man. "We stay until they stop breathing." The words hung in the mist, fragile but absolute, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the guns. The dawn broke in shades of gray and copper, light filtering through the smoke that still curled above the orchard, turning every branch into a silhouette of ruin. Captain Ellery stood outside the tent, his boots half buried in the wet mud, watching steam rise from the earth as the first sunlight hit the soaked ground. The air smelled of gunpowder and apples gone to rot. In the distance the thunder of artillery had faded to an occasional, uncertain echo, like a giant exhaling after a long night of violence. Around him, the camp was silent, except for the quiet rasp of breathing from those who had survived the night. The canvas tent sagged in the middle where the ropes had loosened, rainwater pooling on top. He touched the fabric gently and felt its weight, then let it go. Havers emerged a moment later, carrying a basin of water that had already turned brown from washing. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but her movements were still precise. "We'll need to rebuild before the next push," she said. Ellery nodded, scanning the field for anything usable. The supply trucks were gone, the crates burned or buried, but near the ditch he spotted the remnants of a destroyed ambulance. Its roof peeled open, its frame twisted, but inside the wreck lay lengths of canvas, a few intact poles, and a roll of electrical wire. "That'll do," he said. Together they hauled the salvage through the mud, laying it out beside the tent. The men who could move joined in without being asked, their bandaged hands trembling as they tied ropes and hammered stakes. The orchard became alive again with movement, not the chaos of battle but the deliberate, quiet rhythm of rebuilding. Ellery worked beside them, sleeves rolled, mud streaking his forearms, voice low but steady as he directed each repair. They stripped branches from fallen trees for beams, lashed canvas over the gaps, and dug trenches for drainage. By mid-morning the tent was more a patchwork of salvaged fabric and wire than anything resembling order, yet it stood firm against the wind. The men began calling it the cathedral, half-jokingly, because the center pole was a broken crossbeam from a nearby chapel that had taken a shell hit days earlier. Ellery said nothing about the name, but when he stepped inside and saw the light filtering through the patched roof, he understood why they chose it. The tent glowed like a lantern, the air filled with motes of dust and faint heat. He set up a new operating table from a door laid across two ammo crates. Every sound seemed sharper now. The clink of instruments, the shuffle of boots, the shallow breath of the wounded. Outside, the wind carried voices from the nearby hedgerow, faint and anxious. Scouts returning from the ridge brought grim news. The German armor was regrouping for another push. The nearest friendly line was still miles away. Ellery listened, jaw tightening. "Then this stays standing," he said, motioning toward the tent. "No matter what happens, this place doesn't fall." Havers looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was no argument. They began sterilizing what instruments they had left, heating them over small fires built from broken rifle stocks. One of the men rigged a pulley from the ambulance wire to hoist lanterns higher, and soon the interior was lit with a pale gold glow. Ellery felt the tension settle again, that quiet before the storm when every man knew danger was near, but found comfort in having something to do. The first casualties arrived by noon, carried on stretchers from the forward observation line. A mortar team had been caught in crossfire, and the wounded came in silent, faces pale, eyes wide. Ellery worked quickly, his movements automatic yet precise, the sweat freezing on his neck as he cut, sewed and wrapped. The rhythm was mechanical until one of the soldiers, a boy no older than 19, gripped his wrist mid-suture. "Don't leave me here," the boy whispered, voice cracking. Ellery met his gaze, steady and calm. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The boy's hand relaxed, falling limp against the table. For a moment Ellery thought he'd lost him, but then the chest rose again, shallow but steady. He continued, slower now, forcing his breath to match the boy's. Outside, the orchard had gone eerily quiet again, only the distant hum of engines carrying across the fields. By evening, the tent was full. Bodies lined in rows, some whispering prayers, others motionless except for the flicker of their chests. The air grew hot and heavy from the lamps, thick with the smell of iodine and blood. Havers moved among them, wiping faces, murmuring small reassurances. Ellery felt the exhaustion pressing in on him, the tremor in his hands returning, but he refused to stop. When his scalpel slipped for a fraction of a second and nicked his glove, he froze, staring at the bead of blood that welled against his skin. It was small, insignificant, but it broke something in his focus. He stepped back, wiped his hand, and stared at the tent's entrance where the light from outside flickered with the movement of wind. "Get some rest, sir," Havers said quietly. "You haven't slept since the first night." He didn't answer. Sleep felt like surrender. Instead, he walked out into the orchard, the night air cool against his face. The horizon glowed faintly with gunfire, distant yet constant. He could hear the faint echo of engines again, maybe tanks, maybe transport, impossible to tell. He knelt beside a shallow crater where the rain had pooled and washed the mud from a line of blood-soaked bandages. He stared at them, then lifted one, wringing it out with slow, deliberate pressure until the water ran clear. Behind him, voices murmured from the tent, low and steady, the sound of life. Persisting. When he stood again, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of apples and diesel. He turned back toward the tent and for a moment saw it as something other than what it was. A fragile sanctuary built out of refusal, out of the unwillingness to obey an order that condemned men to die alone. Inside, the light from the morphine lamps glowed like stained glass through the patched canvas, flickering each time the wind passed through. He stepped back inside, his boots squelching in the mud, and resumed work without a word. The hours blurred, marked only by the soft calls for water or the hiss of the lanterns. Once, a plane roared overhead and everyone froze, waiting for the whistle of bombs, but none came. When the sound faded, Ellery exhaled slowly and continued. The night deepened, the lamps burned low, and still he moved between tables, one wound at a time. Near midnight he found Havers sitting by a soldier who had stopped breathing minutes earlier, her hands clasped loosely around his. "He asked if we'd remember his name," she said. Ellery looked at the tag hanging from the soldier's neck, the letters half-smeared. "We will," he said simply. He stepped outside once more, needing air, and found the orchard bathed in moonlight, pale and still. The rebuilt tent stood like a ghost among the trees, its patched walls glowing faintly, the symbol of defiance he hadn't meant to create but could no longer abandon. He watched the smoke drift upward, thinning into the cold sky, and felt both pride and weariness twist together in his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a single flare arced upward, burning white before fading to black. He knew what that meant: movement on the front, another push before dawn. He turned back toward the tent, listening to the muffled breaths and the soft clatter of instruments inside, and realized how fragile their hold on life truly was. For a long moment he stood there, the wind whispering through the trees, the ground still damp beneath his boots, and thought about how easily the world could end here, in a field no map would ever mark. Then he whispered to the dark, not to God or command or anyone living, but to the silence itself. "If this place falls, it falls with me." The words vanished into the wind, leaving only the faint creak of canvas and the steady rhythm of the wounded breathing in unison, a fragile heartbeat against the vast and waiting night. By the fourth morning the sky was the color of wet steel, and the orchard was quieter than it had been since the invasion, a silence so complete it felt wrong, as if the war had paused to draw breath. Captain Ellery stood by the edge of the stream behind the camp, washing his hands in water that ran pink with blood and mud, his reflection trembling with each ripple. The cold bit into his fingers, but he kept scrubbing until the numbness spread up his arms, trying to rid himself of the smell that never left him no matter how hard he washed. Behind him the rebuilt tent loomed against the gray light, patched and scarred yet still standing, the faint smoke from the cooking fire twisting around its edges. Havers approached carrying a canteen and a small bundle of what little food they had left: hardtack, a strip of salted meat, half an apple that had somehow escaped the bombardment. "You need to eat something," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ellery took the apple half, bit into it, and chewed without tasting. He could hear the men inside, the murmured prayers, the coughing, the steady hum of life refusing to quit. The orchard beyond them was a graveyard of broken branches and burned trunks, but in the distance came a sound that made him freeze. The deep rhythmic thud of tank engines, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat too heavy for the ground. Havers heard it too, and looked toward the ridge. "They're closer," she said. Ellery nodded, tossing the apple core into the stream. "Get the wounded ready to move if we have to," he said. "But keep the tent running until the last minute." She didn't ask where they would go. There was nowhere left to go. As she walked back toward the camp, he stayed by the stream, watching the ripples carry bits of ash and leaves downstream, and thought about how the water kept moving no matter how much blood it took in. It didn't judge, didn't stop. It simply carried it all away. He envied that. When he returned to the tent, the air was heavy with the sour-sweet scent of rot and disinfectant. The lamps hissed softly, casting a dull amber glow over faces pale as wax. He moved between the cots, checking pulses, adjusting dressings, whispering a few words to those who stirred. One soldier tried to sit up, a bandage tight across his chest, and Ellery pressed him back down gently. "Easy," he said. "You're safe." The word felt strange leaving his mouth. Outside, the rumble of engines grew louder. A scout stumbled in through the flap, panting. "They're half a mile out, sir. Panzer Division, maybe more. No infantry yet, just armor." Ellery met his eyes. "Any sign of our own?" The man shook his head. "Nothing." The captain exhaled slowly, thinking. They couldn't outrun tanks, not with the wounded, and he refused to leave them behind. His gaze drifted to the pile of crates near the back, the ones marked with faded red crosses, empty now except for scraps of cloth and a few bottles of alcohol. He opened one, stared for a moment, then turned to Havers. "How much fuel do we have left?" She hesitated. "A few liters from the Lantern Reserve." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a scalpel, turning it over in his fingers as if weighing more than its metal. "If they reach us, we can't let them take the wounded," he said finally. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. He wasn't talking about surrender. He was thinking like a man trying to spare others a worse fate. The thought hung between them, unspoken but understood. Then a sound broke it, the faint cry of a voice outside the tent, not English but German. Ellery stepped to the flap, signaling for quiet. Through the trees, a figure emerged. Young, thin, his uniform torn, his helmet gone. The German soldier was bleeding from the shoulder, one hand raised in surrender. He stumbled forward, collapsing near the ditch. For a long second no one moved. Then Ellery walked toward him. "He's wounded," he said to no one in particular, kneeling beside the boy. The soldier's eyes darted between them, wide with fear, breath coming in sharp gasps. Havers appeared behind Ellery, her face pale. "You can't bring him inside," she whispered. "He's the enemy." "He's dying," Ellery said simply. He pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the warm pulse of blood seep through his fingers. "Fetch bandages." She hesitated only a moment before obeying. As Ellery worked, the boy tried to speak, his English broken but clear enough. "No fight," he murmured. "No orders. Lost." Ellery met his gaze and saw something familiar, exhaustion, not hatred. "You're not lost," he said quietly. "You're here." When they carried him inside, the American soldiers looked on in uneasy silence. Some turned away, others muttered under their breath, but none interfered. Ellery operated with the same precision he gave every man there, stitching the wound, setting the shoulder, wrapping it tight. When he finished, the boy was unconscious but breathing evenly. Havers wiped her hands and looked at him. "You'll catch hell for this," she said. He gave a tired smile. "I already have." Outside, the engines were closer still. The ground trembled with each vibration. The tent felt smaller now, the air pressing inward. Ellery ordered the men who could move to dig a shallow trench behind the stream, using helmets and broken spades. They worked silently, mud flying, the sound of metal scraping earth drowned by the low growl of approaching armor. As the first tank silhouettes appeared through the trees, dark against the pale morning, Ellery stood in the doorway of the tent, every sense sharpened. The tanks halted a few hundred yards out, their turrets scanning. He could see the insignia painted on their sides, black crosses barely visible through grime. For several minutes nothing happened, just the eerie quiet of engines idling. Then one fired, the shell slamming into the ridge behind them, sending a plume of soil skyward. He flinched but didn't move. A second shot followed, closer, and the concussion knocked dust from the tent ceiling. Havers shouted for everyone to get down, but Ellery stood still, staring toward the tanks as if trying to read their intent. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the firing stopped. The engines rumbled again, and slowly the armored line turned away, heading north toward the main road. They had been spared, not by strategy or mercy, but by chance. When the sound faded, Ellery exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. He went back inside, the men staring at him as if waiting for explanation, but he had none. He only said, "Back to work." The day passed in fragments, patching wounds, boiling water, writing names on scraps of paper. The German boy woke briefly in the evening, looked around, and whispered something Ellery couldn't understand before slipping back into sleep. Outside, the rain began again, steady and cold. As night fell, Havers brought him a small tin of coffee half cold. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "They always do," he said. He sat beside the German's cot, listening to the rain drum against the canvas, and for the first time in days he allowed his body to go still. Around him the tent breathed softly, the rhythm of men suspended between life and death. He looked at his hands, the skin cracked and raw, and thought about how strange it was that something so fragile could hold so much life. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rumble of distant gunfire again, but further away now. He leaned back against the wooden beam, eyes half closed, and whispered under his breath, "Tomorrow we rebuild again." The words felt heavier than a prayer, more like a promise made to no one, a vow to keep moving until the world gave out. Outside the rain deepened, washing the blood from the soil, and the tent stood against the darkness, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to stop. By the fifth day the orchard no longer smelled of smoke, but of damp earth and decay, the air heavy with the sweetness of rot that clung to every breath like guilt. Captain Ellery woke before dawn. Though he hadn't truly slept, he had drifted in and out of shallow dreams where the wounded called his name from under the soil. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving a cold mist that crawled through the broken trees and clung to the tents like a shroud. He stepped outside and found the world gray and still, the kind of quiet that feels like a warning. The ground was soft beneath his boots, every step sinking into the mud that seemed determined to swallow the orchard whole. Behind him, the wounded stirred restlessly, the low murmur of their voices blending with the faint hiss of the wind through the branches. He looked toward the east where the horizon was beginning to pale, faint light spreading over the wrecked landscape, revealing the bodies of trees torn apart by shells and the glint of metal where a tank had burned out days before. He could see movement near the stream, 2 soldiers dragging something heavy between them. He walked closer and saw they were carrying another stretcher, this one wrapped in a poncho that dripped with water and blood. "Found him by the fence line," one of them said. "Still breathing." Ellery nodded and motioned them toward the tent. Inside, the air was thick and sour, heavy with sweat, iodine, and fatigue. He moved to the table, hands already working before thought could catch up, and began cutting away the poncho. The man beneath it was barely recognizable, his face blackened with burns, his uniform shredded. Havers appeared beside him without a word, her sleeves rolled, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Pulse is weak," she said. "He's not going to make it." Ellery didn't answer. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound, wrapping, sewing, breathing in rhythm with the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. Around them the others watched, their faces pale in the dim lamplight, and when it was done the silence stayed, unbroken except for the sound of rain dripping from the canvas. Ellery straightened, his back stiff, and turned toward the entrance where the faint light of morning crept in. Outside, voices were calling from the road. New arrivals, Americans this time, their uniforms clean compared to his own. A sergeant stepped into view, saluting out of reflex before dropping his hand. "Sir, we've got word from command. Reinforcements landed at Corentin. They're pushing inland. They want all remaining field units consolidated. Ellery studied him for a moment, taking in the young face, the neat uniform, the fresh insignia. Consolidated, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. We're to move to St. Lo by tomorrow, the sergeant continued. Trucks will be here tonight. Behind him, Ellery could see the men and women who had survived this far, the ones who had carried the wounded, who had built and rebuilt their shelter from scraps. He thought of leaving the orchard, of packing up what remained of their lives and abandoning the ground that had become their world. We'll be ready, he said at last, though his voice lacked conviction. When the sergeant left, Havers looked at him with a mixture of relief and dread. We're finally getting out, she said quietly. If the trucks make it through, he replied. They spent the day preparing the wounded, wrapping bandages, checking splints, cleaning what few instruments they had left. The rain returned by afternoon, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the canvas like a heartbeat. The German boy awoke again, sitting upright with a start, his eyes wild until they met Ellery's. Am I prisoner? He asked weakly. You're alive, Ellery said. That's all that matters right now. The boy nodded slowly, lying back with a faint smile that vanished almost immediately. As dusk fell, the trucks arrived, 3 of them, engines rumbling through the mud, headlights cutting through the mist. The sight should have felt like salvation, but Ellery couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The drivers jumped down, their boots splashing in puddles, and one called out, We've got room for 20. That's all. Ellery looked back at the tent. There were 37 men inside who couldn't walk, plus those still conscious but too weak to travel far on foot. We'll rotate them, he said. First trip out tonight, second at dawn. The driver hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky. I don't know if we'll get a second trip, sir. Roads aren't safe after nightfall. Ellery's jaw tightened. You'll get one, he said, his tone final. They began loading the first group. Men lifted carefully, stretchers slid onto wooden planks, hands gripping shoulders to steady the weak. The sound of engines drowned out the whispers, the coughs, the rain. When the first truck pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the fog, Ellery stood for a long time staring at the road, the darkness swallowing it whole. He turned back toward the tent, where those left behind waited in silence. Get some rest, he told them. We move at first light. He went outside, walking to the edge of the orchard, where the stream still ran quietly through the mud. The moonlight glinted off the water, cold and silver. He crouched and splashed his face, the chill biting his skin, then stayed there listening. In the distance, faint and uncertain, came the sound of gunfire. Not close, but closer than he wanted. The front was shifting again. He rose and returned to the tent, his mind already calculating what they would need if the trucks didn't return. Inside, Havers sat beside the last lantern, her head bent, eyes closed, but not asleep. You should rest, he said softly. If I sleep I'll dream, she replied. I can't stand the dreams anymore. He understood. He moved to his cot, not to lie down but to check the satchel beneath it. The small bundle of papers, the roster of names written in his cramped handwriting, each one a promise that someone had lived. He folded it once more and tucked it into his jacket. The night dragged on. Hours passed in a blur of soft rain and muffled breathing, until the low rumble of an engine startled them both. Ellery stepped outside, expecting the returning trucks, but instead saw the glow of fire on the horizon, orange and wild. He felt it in his chest before he heard it, the dull, rolling thunder of explosions. Havers joined him, eyes wide. That's the main road, she said. They're hitting the convoy. The realization sank in like ice. There would be no second trip. The men already taken were either dead or scattered. He turned toward the orchard, toward the wounded still waiting, and for a moment the weight of it nearly broke him. But then he straightened, his expression hardening. We hold here, he said. If they come, we make this ground count. They spent the rest of the night reinforcing the ditch, moving the wounded further back, setting lanterns in shallow pits to keep them low. The rain came harder, drenching them as they worked, but no one stopped. When dawn broke, gray and thin, The fire on the horizon had died, replaced by a haze of smoke stretching across the sky. The men watched him for orders, faces pale and hollow. Ellery looked at them, at the tent still standing despite everything, at the orchard that had sheltered them through hell, and felt something fierce rise in his chest. "No one gets left," he said simply. The words were quiet, but carried through the air like a command carved into stone. As he turned back toward the stream, the first light caught the surface of the water, turning it gold for an instant before the clouds swallowed it again. He watched it fade, then whispered almost to himself, "We're still here." The wind stirred the branches, and the orchard answered only with silence. The morning after the convoy was lost came slow and colorless, a gray light bleeding through the mist that hung over the orchard like a curtain. Captain Ellery stood outside the tent, the world around him silent except for the faint hum of insects returning to life after the rain. The ground was slick, pocked with puddles that mirrored the pale sky, and every step felt heavier than the last. He could hear the labored breathing from inside, the quiet groans of men who no longer asked for rescue because they understood it would not come. He rubbed his hands together to bring back feeling, though the cold had sunk deep into his bones, and his mind moved through every sound, every shadow, waiting for the one that didn't belong. The air was too still. Even the birds had gone quiet. When Havers came out, she carried the field radio wrapped in canvas. "It's dead," she said simply. "No signal, no static, nothing." Ellery looked at her, eyes hollow, then down at the mud at their feet. "Then we stop calling for help," he said. "We make our own." They spent the day scavenging what little remained of the supplies, bandages torn into smaller pieces, alcohol diluted with water, and one final vial of morphine that Ellery pocketed without comment. The wounded watched them move around the tent, faces pale and unreadable, as if they too had become part of the landscape. The orchard stretched in every direction, scarred and blackened, but still it offered shelter. He sent 2 of the steadier men to the ridge to scout, though they returned hours later with nothing but the news that the road was gone, cratered and blocked with wreckage. Beyond that, smoke drifted from what had once been the town. "We're cut off," one of them said. Ellery only nodded. He already knew. As evening approached, the sky turned the color of lead, and the air grew heavy with the promise of more rain. The quiet was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery, faint but steady, a reminder that the war was still crawling closer. Havers worked beside him, her movements automatic, her face drained of all expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "If they push through the line, this place won't stand an hour." Ellery didn't answer right away. He was bent over a patient with a chest wound, his fingers slick with blood. "Then we make it stand for 59 minutes, he said at last. She almost smiled at that but didn't. By nightfall, they had set up a perimeter of lanterns in the orchard, their faint glow wavering through the mist like ghost lights. The men who could still hold rifles took positions behind the ditch, though most were too weak to fire more than once. Ellery walked among them, stopping to rest a hand on each shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing left worth saying. The German boy sat near the entrance of the tent, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes fixed on the distant darkness. "They will come," he said softly, not as a threat but as a truth. Ellery nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The hours that followed stretched thin. The night air was cold, thick with fog that dulled every sound, and time seemed to move in slow, uneven beats. Somewhere near midnight the first shot came, not close but near enough to echo through the orchard. A flare rose in the distance, its light turning the mist a sickly red. The men stirred, gripping their weapons. Ellery felt his heartbeat steady rather than quicken. He turned to Havers, who already had the lanterns dimmed. "We don't fire first," he said. The red light faded, leaving only darkness. Then came the sound of boots in mud, faint but unmistakable, moving through the trees. He crouched behind a fallen trunk, pistol in hand, every nerve alive. A shape emerged through the fog, then another and another. He counted 6 before they stopped at the edge of the orchard. Voices murmured in German, low and cautious. The wounded were silent, even their breathing held. For a moment Ellery thought the soldiers might turn away, but one stepped forward, rifle raised, scanning the shadows. The moon broke through the clouds for an instant, spilling silver light across the orchard and revealing the tent, the lanterns, the faces watching from the dark. The soldiers shouted an order, and everything happened at once. Gunfire cracked through the stillness, the muzzle flashes lighting the trees. Bullets tore through the canvas, glass shattered, someone screamed. Ellery fired twice, the recoil jarring his arm, and saw one figure drop before he ducked back behind the trunk. Havers pulled a wounded man out of the line of fire, blood streaking her sleeves. The gunfire lasted only minutes, then faded as suddenly as it had begun. The fog swallowed the echoes, leaving behind only the sound of labored breathing and dripping rain. When Ellery stood again, the ground was littered with shell casings and silence. He moved through the orchard, gun raised, scanning the shadows, but the Germans were gone, leaving only one motionless body among the roots. The rest had retreated. He knelt beside the fallen soldier, his uniform damp and dark. A boy, no older than the one inside. He pressed his fingers to the throat, no pulse. He sat back, the exhaustion hitting him all at once. The world felt distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. When he returned to the tent, Havers was kneeling beside another cot. One of their own had been hit. Ellery didn't ask who. He simply went to work, hands steady, eyes focused on the narrow band of flesh beneath the light. The hours bled together. When it was over, the lanterns were nearly out of oil, and the rain had returned, steady and cold. He stepped outside again, the wind tugging at his coat, and looked toward the ridge. The fog was clearing now, revealing the faint outline of dawn, a pale smear of light above the horizon. Somewhere out there the front was still moving, the armies shifting like tides. He wondered if anyone beyond this orchard even knew they were here, if his defiance had meaning beyond this small circle of mud and blood. Havers joined him, standing silently at his side. "What happens now?" she asked. He watched the light strengthen, spreading across the ruined field, touching the broken trees with color. "Now," he said quietly, "we wait for whoever's left to find us." They stood there until the sun broke through, weak but real, its warmth touching their faces for the first time in days. The orchard looked different under the light, still destroyed, but alive somehow, steam rising from the wet earth like breath. Ellery closed his eyes for a moment, feeling it, memorizing the sensation of peace that didn't belong here but came anyway. When he opened them, he saw movement on the ridge, figures in the distance, too far to tell if they were friend or foe. He raised the field glasses taken from a fallen officer, adjusted the focus and froze. The helmets were allied, the insignia clear. Relief hit him like a wave, and yet he didn't cheer, didn't speak. He just lowered the glasses slowly, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Havers turned to him. "Is it over?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." The figures were still moving, slow and cautious, their rifles ready. He knew they would reach the orchard by midday, maybe sooner, and then everything would change. Reports, questions, orders. But for now, it was enough to stand there and know they had survived. Behind him the tent fluttered in the wind, its patched walls catching the sunlight, the symbol of what they had built and refused to abandon. He walked back toward it, pausing at the entrance to look once more at the orchard that had been both graveyard and refuge. The mist was rising, dissolving into the sky, and for the first time he could see clear to the far edge of the field. He felt the ache in his shoulders, the sting in his eyes, and the weight of every life he had tried to hold on to. Then he stepped inside, the canvas closing behind him, and the sound of the wind faded, leaving only the quiet breathing of the living, and the faint rustle of fabric that sounded almost like the whisper of something grateful.